Good afternoon. My name is Ned Lazaro, and I'm the Associate Curator of Costume and Textiles at the Wadsworth Atheneum. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Artful Conversations, a monthly virtual program offered to museum members and sponsored by our development department. This program is organized by my wonderful colleague, Diana Reeve, and our AV wizard is Eric Bowen. Just a reminder, during Dr. Hayward's talk today, type your questions into the chat and she will get to those when she finishes. Today, distinguished professor, author, and England's King Henry VIII, as seen in the amazing 1540 portrait by Holbein. This painting is currently on loan to the Wadsworth from the Palazzo Barberini in Rome. And you may know that we lent our Caravaggio painting of St. Francis of Assisi in Ecstasy to the Palazzo Barberini for a major Caravaggio show there. And in return, we made out pretty well with the loan of this portrait. The Henry VIII portrait can be seen in our Baroque gallery until early July of this year, so do come and see it in person if you haven't already. You'll be rewarded by close looking at this masterpiece that we are so excited and honored to share with our visitors. Dr. Maria Hayward is Professor of Early Modern History and head of the department at the University of Southampton. She is an expert on textiles and clothing worn at the Tudor and Stuart courts. We'll include a selection of her published works in the chat. They are fabulously informative and very well written. Dr. Hayward's incredible career as a dress historian includes previous work as a textile conservator, and it is this combined experience that makes her the leading expert on today's topic, Displaying Power, Henry VIII's portrait from the Palazzo Barberini. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Hayward.
Thank you. Thank you, Ned. Thank you so much for your very kind invitation and your very kind introduction. And it is lovely to be here today as part of this wonderful exhibition of the Barberini portrait at the Wadsworth Atheneum. Henry VIII is a well-known historical figure, and his portraits are familiar, but there is a surprisingly small number of them. Indeed, there are just 7 distinct portrait types, which means that the details they provide about his clothing is both limited and specific. The Barberini portrait is similar in terms of pose and clothing to the cluster of images created for Henry VIII by Hans Holbein the Younger in the period of around about 1536 to 1537, which includes the Thyssen-Bornemisza half-length, which you can see on the left, the Whitehall cartoon, the full-length version, which you can see in the middle, and one of the later full-lengths, which you can see on the right, which belongs to the Walker Art Gallery. The full-length version was intended to decorate the Palace of Whitehall, and the approximate date range, so from 1536 to 1537, means that it may have been intended to mark Jane Seymour's pregnancy, which began in 1536, or the birth of the long-awaited son, Edward, in 1537, which marked the securing of the succession. These paintings also came shortly after the break with Rome and Henry's establishment as head of his own national church. Less positively, Henry was also under threat of excommunication at this point by Clement VII, a threat that was carried out by Paul III on the 17th of December, 1538. Henry's chosen artist, Hans Holbein the Younger, manipulated the king's body in the full-length image in the centre to make him appear taller and more impressive, while he depicted every detail of his clothing to stress the king's power, by placing emphasis on his elegance and magnificence. Now, having looked at these 3 paintings to set our scene, I will move on to what I will cover in the rest of this short talk, which is divided into 3 sections. The first offers a brief review of what Henry was wearing in the Barberini portrait. The second how these clothes expressed ideas about power in the 16th century, and third, what is significant about the particular clothes that Holbein painted Henry in for that particular portrait. So let's return to the Barberini portrait. And from this, it is possible to identify the layers of clothing that Henry is wearing, from his shirt to his gown, and all of the necessary accessories and jewels that were prerequisites for any well-dressed, high-status male in 1540. And so let's have a look at what we can see. So the first layer that Henry would have put on when he got dressed in the morning was his linen shirt. And from the portrait, we can see two details. So we can see the small stand double collar around the neck, and with the little linen ties keeping it closed, and also on this at the end of the sleeves we can see the small gathered wrist ruffles. Now, to put those details into context, if we have a look at this shirt, which dates from the 1540s and which is in the collection of the V&A, you can see how long this garment was. It would have come down to at least the mid-thigh and had full-length sleeves, but the high stand collar in this example is heavily embroidered. But again, you can see the little thread work loops, the ties that would have been there to hold the collar in place. Over the shirt, which was a very significant garment because, of course, it was the one worn against the king's body, so it touched the anointed skin of the skin of the anointed monarch. Over this, we would have had the doublet and hose. These were the main garments that men would have worn at this period. Although in some of the portraits, it's difficult to tell whether Henry is actually wearing a doublet or whether he's wearing a partlet and low-cut doublet, or equally a partlet and a jerkin. Here we can see that his upper garment is close-fitting to the body, but comes out with a slight swell over the lower stomach and with close-fitting sleeves, and has the high neckline, which was characteristic of this period. Here you can see two examples of doublets and hose from this period. The one on the left is from the Pitti Palace in Florence, the one on the right, the collection in Dresden. And in both cases, you can see that the doublet has this similar cut to the one we can see in Henry's portrait, and also that the doublet is made of a satin, while the upper part of the hose, the trunk hose, is made of panes of velvet. And one of the virtues of showing you this is how you can see the doublet and hose work together. But of course, if we go back to the portrait of Henry, because this is a half length, we can't really see that much detail of the hose. Indeed, what we can see are parts of the upper stocks of the hose and the codpiece, which was intended to cover the front opening of the hose. Here are some examples of hose, so in other words, a better sense of what Holbein did not paint in this. The examples on the left are a pair of knitted hose. These are Italian and are also from the collection in Dresden. And Henry did have pairs of knitted hose like this, both in yellow and also in purple. And on the other side, you can see examples of a much simpler and lower status pair of hose. But again, you can see how they're designed to fit the legs closely. Over the doublet and hose was worn the main and most flamboyant of garments. So this would have been the gown. Here, because of the way that Henry is sort of quite compressed by the framing by Holbein, we can just see details of the gown. So here I'm showing you some of the details of the sleeves. You can see that there is a short upper sleeve and then a hanging vestigial sleeve that hangs down, and there's a slit in that sleeve that Henry could have put his arms through if he wanted to wear the full sleeve, or if he chose not to, he could then wear it as you can see here. The gown was trimmed with fur and also lined with fur. And here is an example of one of these gowns. They were cut from essentially a full circle of fabric, or rather the fabric was pieced to create a full circle. This example wasn't fur-lined, but instead had decorative guards of velvet, but it has the same sleeve arrangement that we could see in the portrait, and in this example you can see again the sleeves of the doublet coming through the sleeves of the gown. Now, to finish off an outfit for any well-dressed man at this period, you would have required a bonnet, such as the one that we can see Henry wearing here. This would have been of black velvet, trimmed with ostrich feathers and decorated with clusters of pearls and decorative jewel set and enamelled brooches. Now, in Henry's case, the emphasis is on jewellery, but if you look in many of Holbein's other drawings and paintings of men of this period, you can see that they often chose brooches and decoration that reflected either their religious interests or equally their intellectual and academic interests. So while a hat was an essential part of any man's wardrobe at this point, it was also a way in which they could again display their wealth, but also their intellectual interests. And if we move on to consider the hat, here I'm giving you a much less expensive example to the one that Henry's wearing. This is a knitted example, but it shows you that men of all social ranks would have worn the cap or bonnet, and some examples of the sorts of shoes, again a much lower status set of shoes, two different types, but it still gives you a sense of the types of shoes that Henry would have been wearing with this outfit. And finally, I mentioned that accessories were a vital part of any man's wardrobe at this point. We can see Henry with two of the quintessential accessories for a well-dressed aristocratic man. So in his right hand, he is holding a pair of gloves. He had many pairs of gloves. These would have been of a very soft, high-quality leather, and were very much for being carried and displayed, as well as worn. But he would have also had more practical gloves, such as for hawking. Whereas his left hand rests upon the hilt of his dagger. And in some other portraits we see him with both sword and dagger, but it's more typical that he is depicted with dagger. And the last thing just to highlight is that jewellery was essential for any monarch at this period and any well-dressed man of high status. And we can see Henry wearing the jewelled collar, along with a gold chain with pendant, two rings on his left hand, two on the right, and then most potentially importantly, his clothes are embellished with a set of jewels that are stitched to them. So this whole ensemble created a sense of the king's wealth and authority. So if we move on now to think about how clothes conveyed ideas about royal power, I want to return to the portrait to sort of really stress to you that in the 16th century, clothes were an expression of the social hierarchy. And as the monarch and their family were at the apex of that social pyramid, royal clothes were used to set them apart from their subjects by asserting the sovereign's power and authority. And they could do that in a variety of ways. One would be by having the sheer quantity of clothes that Henry had. His wardrobe was regularly stocked by this period with orders made each spring and each autumn. In addition, for important occasions, such as a royal wedding or meetings with ambassadors, Henry would have new clothes that he would not wear again on another occasion. And also, the fact that he has so many layers was an expression of wealth, and that also he could alternate those layers to create an infinite variety of outfits. So while clothing was designed within England to place Henry at the top of the social pyramid, When he was seeking to position himself alongside his fellow monarchs, he was very much trying to present himself as their equal. The two monarchs that he was most interested in presenting himself as the equal of were Francis I, King of France, who you can see on the left, and Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, who you can see on the right. Interestingly, while both of them were also interested in their appearance, it is possible to suggest that Henry's are more opulent or more overt, dependent on your point of view, than those of Francis and Charles. And indeed, contemporaries often said that Henry was very keen on large amounts of jewels and a very big display of gold. So I mentioned gold as being essentially the quintessential way that you would stress status at this period. And here you can see gold and silver gilt threads integrated into the most expensive textiles of the day. On the left, you can see a cloth of tissue. This was the most expensive of the textiles available at the time, the reason being that in addition to containing the metal wrapped wefts that were woven into the design, it also contained threads that were woven in the form of little loops, and those little loops required a lot more thread than when the thread was woven in flat. So this is why cloth of tissue was the most expensive of all of the cloths of gold. Whereas on the right, you can see a more standard cloth of gold. This does have some loops, but it also has a white ground with the design executed in a black silk velvet. So this gives you another example of one of these opulent textiles. And these were something that to a modern mind we might equate with luxury. But in the 16th and 15th centuries, for the social elite, they presented them in terms of the idea of magnificence. And one of the things about magnificence was that it was something that was necessary for the elite to engage with. Sir John Fortescue, who was an important writer of the period, expressed this in the following way. So he said, and I quote, "It is necessary that the king has such treasure that he may buy himself rich stones, rich clothes, and other jewels and ornaments as befits his royal majesty." And that he went on to add that if the king didn't do so, then he wasn't dressing according to his status, and that was inappropriate in a monarch. So how does that translate then into what we can see Henry wearing in this portrait? Or rather, this portrait. So this portrait shows Henry with his family in about 1547. And it's in terms of the royal family that ideas about magnificence were expressed. And these ideas were conveyed to Henry's people through the acts of apparel. Now, we might know these acts of apparel better as sumptuary laws now. So in other words, laws that sought to regulate who could, in this case, wear particular things and who could not. And in terms of Henry's acts of apparel, there were 4 that he passed during the course of his reign, and each of them began with the things that were exclusive to him, his queen, and their children. So in 1510 and 1514, the Acts of Apparel stated that purple cloth of gold and purple silk were exclusive to the royal family. By 1515, black jennet, which was the fur of the civet cat, had been added to the list. And by 1533, there was a subtle change to what was said about purple. This now said that purple silk and purple cloth of gold of tissue were exclusive to the royal family, along with sable. And if we look at this painting, we can see lots of cloth of gold of tissue and lots of sable, but no purple. Purple was something that Henry actually wore remarkably little. In that sense, it was something that was reserved for very special occasions, and the most special of these were usually the key liturgical feasts, which were purple-wearing days. So if we move back to a detail from the portrait that we're thinking about this afternoon, I want to give you a sense of where Henry's clothes came from to help sort of put them into context. So Henry's wardrobe was very much a global wardrobe. While most of it was actually made in England, the actual materials that it was made from were imported. And so this gives us a brief insight into those things. So if we start off with the textiles that we can see in the portrait, we can see cloth of gold, cloth of tissue, velvets and other silk fabrics. And in the early to mid 16th century, these would have come from Italy. And to help you get a sense of how much these might have cost, cloth of gold in the early part of Henry's reign ranged from £1, 8 shillings and 4pence to £6 a yard. As a modern equivalent, that is between £736 and £3,120 a yard, or in dollars, $974 to $4,130 a yard. And to make a gown like the one you can see in Henry's portrait, you'd have needed probably 10 to 12 yards. So that gives you a sense of the cost we're talking about. The linen for his shirt would have come from the Low Countries, and in 1516 Sir John Heron purchased linen to make Henry's 5 shirts for Henry, and with the making and the linen, 5 shirts would have come to £7 and 13 shillings, or in modern amounts, £3,970, or just over $5,000. In terms of the dye stuffs, this explains then why these fabrics were so expensive. The red colour that you can see here could have been from kermes, which would have come from the Mediterranean, or by the 1530s, it might have been cochineal from Mexico. Whereas the black that we saw to dye Henry's hat, that was achieved by a double dyeing process using woad and then madder. The sable fur that lines and trims Henry's gown here would have been brought to England by merchants of the Hanseatic League, and they were trading with Russia, Scandinavia and the Baltic. And as I mentioned, sable from the 1530s was the fur that is the most commonly found in Henry's wardrobe. And to again give you a sense of what those might have cost, 10 timbers of sables, and a timber was 40 skins, so this is 400 sable skins that had been bought for the king just before his death, were sold to the king's skinner for £240, which comes to £65,900 or $87,000. So a huge amount of money also kept in storage in these very expensive textiles. But it's potentially the jewels which are the most of the exotic things that are making up Henry's ensemble here. So we would have had pearls from the Americas, diamonds from India, and equally other jewels that he wore. So he favoured sapphires, which were coming from Burma, India and Sri Lanka, rubies from Burma and emeralds from Colombia. And the gold for all of this would have been coming from either West Africa or the Americas. And the amount of gold that you can see on this set of clothes is not an exaggeration by Holbein. To just give you one example, on the 27th of May, 1519, Robert Amadas, who was the king's goldsmith, received, and by that they're basically sort of recovering the metal from a gown, he received 448.75 ounces of fine gold and 850 matched pearls that had been taken from one of the coats. So in other words, this ensemble that you can see here represents sort of global trade and an enormous financial investment. So from that point of view, while they might present it as ideas of luxury, it is ideas of magnificence, it is very much a serious investment in the king's appearance. So if we return to the portrait, for my final section, one of the things that is often suggested about this painting is that it was produced to mark Henry's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves. Now, a royal wedding would certainly explain his opulent dress, but as we all know, he was less than impressed by his bride, and the marriage was a very short one, which does raise the question, why would Henry seek to commemorate it? However, while it was a very short marriage, it is also, in many ways, the best documented in terms of what Henry wore. Even though the king's clothing accounts have been lost for the period in question, we do have some very good descriptions in the Chronicle of Edward Hall. So Anne arrived at Deal in Kent on the 27th of December 1539, and then she processed to London via Dover, Canterbury and Rochester, and Henry met her at Shooter's Hill, which is just by Blackheath, on the 3rd of January, and from there they travelled to Greenwich. And this slide gives you a description of what he wore for that first meeting with Anne. And I think it's particularly significant that he chose to wear a coat of purple velvet. So one of the few occasions when he wore purple, he felt it was appropriate for his first meeting with his new bride. And Hall describes it as being embroidered all over with flat gold, and in essence, essentially covered completely. And then in addition to that, as we can see in the portrait that we're looking at, in the similar way, lots of large gems set in gold that are then stitched to his gown, coat and doublet. And here from these details, you can see the effect that amount of close embroidery would have created on the king's clothes. So you can see there are multiple different patterns incorporated into that embroidery, and very little of the expensive ground fabric is actually visible. You can also see here, though, again, these large gems. They're probably diamonds that are set, and they're sort of a matching set of them. For his actual wedding day, we have two garments that Henry wore. The first was a gown of cloth of gold, so similar to the one that we can see in the portrait, described as being raised with great flowers of silver. So again, they're contrasting here the silver and gold thread. It's furred in this case with black ginnet and then worn over a coat of crimson, which again is covered in embroidery. And again, we have many diamonds. But within the hour, he'd changed that gown for another. And this was of rich tissue lined with crimson. So in that sense, neither of these descriptions completely map onto what we can see in this portrait. However, there are many reasons why Holbein might either be presenting us with different clothes, or that Hall's descriptions do not completely map onto this. But the key thing is that what Hall is providing us with is clear descriptions of clothing of the type that Henry was wearing in 1540, and they are incredibly opulent. So let's move briefly to his bride. Here we can see Anne of Cleves, and more importantly, here we can see Holbein's portrait of Anne in the Louvre, which has been recently cleaned and conserved. And so if you've seen this before, you may well remember it with the very dark background, but here we can see it with the original blue, luxurious blue background, which really makes a strong contrast against the crimson and gold of the clothes that she wore in this portrait where she was being presented as a prospective bride to Henry. And Here we can see her wearing the fashions of her own country. And here you can see a closer detail, and in particular the difference here in that we can see mostly the fabric is left unornamented except for the applied bands of gold passementerie, which have then been stitched with pearls. So a very different way of creating magnificence to the one that was created for Henry. So here are the descriptions of Anne's clothes from her wedding day. So again, she had very specific clothes, and as you would expect for a bride, she is dressed in the style of the country that she came from. And you can see that it's noted as being very rich. Again, there's the use of cloth of gold. Again, the reference to lots of pearls being used to decorate her clothes, and the note that to Hall's eyes at least, this looks like the Dutch fashion. And we can see, interestingly, that on her, while her hair is loose, as you would expect for a virginal bride, she is wearing a little coronal, which includes branches of rosemary, which is very interesting as a note for the sort of the bridal appearance. And then after, at the end of the day, just before dinner, she changed into a different gown. And again, you can see that it was strikingly different to what women would have been wearing at the Tudor court. And where I mentioned earlier that it was traditional in certainly at Henry's court that for key events all items would be new, you can see that they note that here she's wearing a headdress that she'd worn previously on the previous Saturday. But then he goes on to add that it was so rich of pearl and stones, so in other words, precious stones, that it was judged to be of great value. So they can see why she might have chosen to re-wear it. So in conclusion, here we have the portrait that we've been considering briefly today. The portrait presents Henry, aged 49, as a man in his prime. The clothes and pose were designed to stress his health, strength and virility, in tandem with his political authority and the legitimacy of his rule. While the details of the clothes do not specifically match the description of his wedding clothes that Hall records, they are very much of the opulent, heavily embellished style of the period. And as Hall indicated, ultimately, the clothes were only a vehicle to express Henry's higher virtues. So Hall said, and notwithstanding that this rich apparel and precious jewels were pleasant to the nobles and all other being present to behold, yet his princely countenance, his goodly person, and royal gesture so far exceeded all other creatures there present, that in comparison of his person, all his rich attire was of little esteem. So as such, while the clothes were important and indeed central to royal magnificence, they were a pale comparison to his actual personal kingly virtues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was a wonderful talk, and my hand is sore from taking so many notes. So that was terrific. I think we have time for some questions if you're so inclined, and I might kick us off with a question. What, if any, garments survive today?
Sadly, as far as we know at the moment, none of Henry's garments have survived. The closest that we can get to this in terms of things, small accessories that are associated with him are a hood, a hawk hood covered in cloth of tissue, and a hunting glove that belonged to the Ashmolean. And these little tiny items give you a sense of the sort of the magnificent nature of his wardrobe. And one of the reasons why things don't survive is because Henry tended to give his clothes away sort of periodically throughout his reign, whereas with the examples that I showed you from some of these other European collections, especially for example in Dresden, they had a different approach to the royal wardrobe, where they actively retained items that were worn for key events such as coronations, weddings, christenings, and they placed them in the royal wardrobe and they archived them. So we can see two different approaches to royal clothes, and so, but unfortunately, because Henry chose to give his away, I think this probably explains why we don't have anything so far that can be attributed directly to him.
Okay, and that your answer sort of ties into some other questions we got in the chat. So if he only wore them once, it was sort of after that first wearing that they were sort of given away in various ways. I see.
Yes.
Another question, thank you. Another question from the chat: is the pendant design significant, hanging off his gold chain?
That's a very good question. No, I don't think it is in this particular instance. In that sense, it's an interesting choice. More usually, we would see him with the garter collar, or with the Lesser George hanging on a chain. So in this case, I don't think there is a particular meaning behind this, which is quite surprising actually, as you might well have expected that he'd have worn either his own Order of Chivalry or one of the others. So the Order of St Michael that he was given by Francis I, and also the Order of the Golden Fleece, which he also was a member of.
Maria, do you know how the portrait ended up at the Palazzo Barberini? How did this English monarch's portrait get to Italy?
No, I'm afraid that is something I do not know the answer, but I suspect you might, Ned.
Well, I believe that our director Matthew Hargraves and our curator of European paintings Oliver Tossman were discussing this topic with some members last week, and I think up until maybe the 19th century, we don't know. So we're missing the period of Henry's reign to about the 19th century, how it got into Italy. But I believe they said then it shows up in the 19th century there. So that's what we could say about that. We have a question that is maybe asking for a little more detail for cloth of gold. So they're asking about, I think, the gold thread itself, and maybe cloth of tissue, specifically, what does tissue mean in the 16th century?
So tissue refers to the type of fabric that we can see on the left. So it's the specific term that they use, and it is the loops that are the distinctive feature of the cloth of tissue. So, and it becomes particularly, it greatly increases the amount of metal thread that is required for these designs. The person who's written the most on this is Lisa Monas. She's a particular expert on these silk textiles, and she has written several very really important sort of articles on these. Equally, if anyone has the opportunity to have a look at her book that she produced for the V&A on their collection of velvets, then you'll find there lots of discussion about these textiles, and also weave diagrams. So you can see then the fact that the warps and then the various wefts that they have to create this. So as with the one on the right, because of the velvet, you will have pile warps and normal warps, and you will also then have the binding wefts for the pile, and also these are very complex weaves. And so yes, Lisa Monas, equally in the volume on the 1547 inventory of Henry VIII, she wrote a really important chapter looking at the textiles that Henry had in store, and there she sort of looks at the yardage of these fabrics that he has in his possession, as these are all imported into England, he sort of stockpiles them. So the Italian merchants came on regular selling trips, and Henry bought whatever they were selling because they weren't that easy to come by. So but the virtue of this was it did mean that obviously he would be wearing sort of, if he bought the whole loom length, as it were, he would have sole access to that particular length of fabric. One of the things that you see in the written descriptions of cloth of gold is they're often referred to as different colours. So that's why I showed you the one that's on the left, where it's got a white ground and a black design. Cloth of tissue can also have coloured components as well. So it is the loops really that make the distinction and are the really important element.
And the actual metallic threads, can you just briefly explain
Yeah,
what those are?
absolutely, absolutely. So the threads have a silk core, which could be dyed. So and the colour that they were dyed would then tone with the metal strip that was wrapped around them. So quite often, those threads that were wrapped with gold or more usually silver gilt threads might well have a yellow core. And so with these metal threads, it was usually a very thin strip of silver gilt that was then wrapped around the silk core. And dependent on how tightly wrapped it was, would depend on how much, if any, of the silk core you could see. And so that was one of the reasons why it was dyed, so that it could either be eye-catching, if it was a strong contrast to the metal, or it could sort of hope to visually infill if it was more spaced out. So the simple metal threads have one strip of metal thread wrapped around them, but you could get more complex ones that might have two strips or three strips of metal thread, and then they could wrap in two different directions and spiral around, so creating a different thread. In some cases, they might have a slightly crimped surface, so again, they would catch the light slightly differently. And in some cases, you might have a strip and a wire wrapped around. So there were lots of different types and qualities of metal thread available. So here we can see where the metal thread has been incorporated, woven into the textiles. But if we look at something like this, the embroidery would all have been done in metal thread. And again, here, this is where they could have really made use of the fact that you could get the gold threads in sort of different, dependent on the gold composition or the gilt composition, or whether you mixed and combined silver gilt with silver. You could then contrast the different tones of the metal, but also then whether the threads had the smooth strip or a crimped strip or a wire would all give you lots of different visual effects. And so in essence, also different thicknesses. So that's what you can see here, that there are a whole variety of different threads and sort of wires that were used to create these embroideries. So they were quite heavy as well. So they're really going to add to the sense of and tricky to work with. I think you have to have quite strong hands to work with these, and so a lot of the professional embroiderers were men. They weren't, not all, but a lot were, whereas the people making the silk trimmings, they were still predominantly women.
Given the amount of metallic thread and embroidery in some of these garments, is it possible to estimate how much the weight of Henry VIII's clothing, say, in this portrait would be, or a surviving garment that you know of from
Um,
another monarch?
I suspect it probably would be. It isn't something I've ever done, but I think it's sort of, these clothes are quite, so the gown, for instance, would have been quite a heavy garment, especially with the fur lining. So those fur linings could be put in for winter and taken out for the summer. So in that sense, the weight would vary. Equally, some of the doublets have sort of some padding and interlining. So again, that those things would all sort of vary how they would feel. But no, I'm afraid that's not one of the things I've tried doing. But Yes, you are looking at large quantities of metal thread for these sorts of garments. Just to sort of put the number of jewels and things into context, a gown, so similar to the gold one that you see here, a purple damask gown, it had these sort of jewel buttons set on it. And they, to make them up, they consisted of 130 diamonds and 131 flowers of gold. So you're looking at a lot of metal. And that gown I mentioned that was decorated probably in a lot of these buttons and in some cases initials and things like that of gold that was stitched to it at sort of nearly 450 ounces of gold. That's a substantial amount.
Wow. We've got a question about the how I think the question is how long would it take Henry to get dressed or be dressed for an event where he's wearing clothes like this? Is there any estimation of time?
Let's put it this way, it wouldn't have taken anywhere near as long as it would have taken to get Elizabeth I dressed. The suggestion is that to get Elizabeth dressed in the morning, it could well have taken several people an hour and a half, because you've got to pin all of the fabric in place sort of around the farthingale. I think it would take less time, so it probably would take maybe at least half an hour. But the thing is that, of course, there would be multiple people. So at this period, it would have been someone like Sir Anthony Denny, who was, the yeoman of the robes would arrive with the clothes. The yeoman of the robes was a member of the Privy Chamber. They would be pre-warmed so that they would be nice to put on, and there would be multiple people to help him put on his shirt, his hose, then lace the doublet to the hose. They would be attached with points and eyelets around the waistband. So yes, it would be multiple people, and he would change his clothes several times in the day, and that not just for his wedding, but for other days as well. So he would have spent quite a lot of time getting dressed, getting undressed, and changing clothes as he went between, say, meetings with his Privy Council, time out hunting, then a sort of a small revel or something in the evening. So yes, clothes would have made up a big part of his day, but probably interspersed throughout.
Great. And see, I think just a couple more questions. One is, so he's wearing these clothes once, he's giving them away. Who is the recipient of these clothes? So for example, you can't, if I get something from Henry VIII, I can't go out necessarily and wear them. It might not be practical, I might not be allowed to. So what are happening to these clothes once they're given away?
So yes, you're absolutely right. The law would say that dependent on your social standing, that these fabrics wouldn't be permitted to you normally. However, with the king's discretion, then you could be permitted to wear them. And so this is why we can see people like Sir Henry Guildford, for instance, who as a knight is quite lowly relatively in terms of his social standing, but if you look at the clothes, they are very similar to Henry's. And of course, if you are the king's best friend, then you can get away with, well, you are permitted lots of things. But for most people, they would have been members of the royal household, and in most cases, they probably would not have worn them. It is likely that they would have either sold them, because there would have been a lot, they would have been very valuable in terms of the amounts of fabric present within them. If they were not the cloth of gold items, but they were maybe, a more sedate black velvet or something like that, then, you might well have had it remade. You could have had it remade into something for your wife because women weren't included in the sumptuary legislation, or you could have had it made into things for your home, or you might have kept it as a hallowed memory of, your king's benevolence to you. But yes, it's really interesting that there's quite a wide social spectrum of individuals who were given things by the king. They were mostly members of his household. they were mostly men, but not always. Occasionally, a woman might be given something, and again, we're not thinking that she would have worn them, but whether, again, the reworking of the fabric was likely. And there are certain things he only wore once, other things he might have worn once or twice. But yes, it's all part of that sense of generosity and largesse to give these things away, and that also fits with this idea of them not being luxurious, because he's then sharing that wealth with others.
Thank you. And our final question, are the white puffs that we see through the slashes of his sleeve, is that actually his shirt showing through, or is that like a lining that's supposed to sort of reference early slashing there?
It's the latter. So there are descriptions in the accounts where they actually provide extra linen and a very fine, lightweight white silk to make these little puffs, which are stitched in place. Absolutely. So especially all of the small ones that you can see, those are just stitched in place. There may be a few places sometimes where it is the shirt, but again, trying to keep all of that in place is really not so practical. So yes, there's lots of the small ones, they are stitched in place, and again, that would have been something that you could have renewed if they were getting squashed, or equally, again, that would have been then the problem for someone else when it had been passed to them.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. Your talk today was incredible. This concludes our artful conversation for April, and we appreciate all of the member support for the Wadsworth Atheneum. Your support makes events like this possible. You will all receive a recording of the talk today. If you just can't get enough of Henry, please check the chat for a lot more Henry VIII related programming at the Wadsworth, including a Tudor banquet, which will be held in person at the museum on Friday, May 30th. Also a first Thursday sort of Renaissance party and other programming and lectures as well. Information on all this can of course, be found on our website as well. Please join us again on May 20th at noon for our next virtual conversation, in which my colleague Erin Monroe, Kriebel Curator of American Sculpture and Painting, will host art historian Rachel Spiegel-Gerstein, discussing the Wadsworth's Portrait of Minette by Camille Pizarro. Again, thank you to Dr. Hayward for her time today, and thank you for joining us today and being a valued member of the Wadsworth Atheneum. Thank you.